The whole neighborhood laughed when they saw what he built, and now they know why. A retired veteran in a worn red and black flannel jacket moved to a snowbound town, just trying to survive another brutal winter with his loyal German shepherd by his side. While others stacked firewood the old way, he stretched a strange canvas tunnel across his frozen yard. People called it useless, dangerous, a joke. But when the blizzards hit and the cold pushed families to the edge, that useless tunnel kept his firewood dry, his cabin warm, and his dog curled safely by the hearth. What started as mockery turned into desperation, and then into respect. And the simple idea they ignored would end up saving more than one household that winter. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel through the cold. Late October settled over Houghton, Michigan, with a damp cold that crept into wood, bone, and memory. The rain had fallen for days without urgency, then slowed, thickened, and finally surrendered to heavy, half-melted snow that slapped the ground instead of floating, turning yards into dark slush and every footstep into a quiet complaint. Frank Dalton stood just inside the door of his small cabin, listening to the sound of it against the tin roof, that wet, tired sound that meant nothing would dry today. Frank was an old veteran in his late 60s, broad-shouldered once, now slightly stooped, his body carrying the permanent geometry of long marches and longer winters. His face was angular and deeply lined, the lines not soft with age but carved, as if the wind off Lake Superior had taken a personal interest in him. A gray beard, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, clung stubbornly to his jaw, and his eyes, steel blue, alert even at rest, had the look of a man who watched more than he spoke. He wore the same thing he wore most days, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, dark jeans stiff with old stains, and boots that had been resoled so many times, the leather looked older than the man himself. He had learned, long ago, that comfort was earned, not purchased, and that winter did not respect pride. Outside, 20 feet from the cabin door, his firewood pile sat hunched like a defeated animal, 4 cords of oak and maple he had split in spring, now soaked through, the outer logs blackened with moisture, the inner ones pressed against cold earth that refused to let go of the water it had swallowed. Inside the cabin, the stove coughed and hissed instead of roaring. Linda Dalton moved quietly near the table, her frame slim and slightly bent, not from age but from years of learning how to move around other people's exhaustion. She was in her early 60s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with long brown hair gone mostly gray, usually tied back in a loose knot that always seemed on the verge of falling apart. Her skin was pale and sensitive to the cold, flushed pink at the cheeks, her hands dry and cracked despite careful tending. Linda had a gentleness to her, not the fragile kind, but the sort forged by responsibility raising children, surviving lean years, learning when to speak and when silence was kinder. That morning, a deep cough caught in her chest, harsh and rattling, and she turned her face away instinctively, embarrassed by the sound, though Frank heard it anyway. Near the hearth, Mia and Lucy slept curled together on a blanket, small bodies tucked into each other for warmth. Mia, 8 years old, had dark hair and serious eyes too old for her face, while Lucy, 5, was all softness round cheeks, pale blonde curls flattened by sleep, her thumb hovering near her mouth even in dreams. They had gone to bed wearing sweaters, socks, and fear, though none of them had named it aloud. Frank lifted the stove door and fed it another split log. The kindling caught quickly, hopeful flames dancing for a moment. Then the wet wood began to steam, surrendering heat to moisture, filling the cabin with thick white smoke that stung the eyes. Linda coughed again. Frank closed the damper halfway, jaw tightening, not in anger, but calculation. He had faced worse than this. But worse was never personal the way this was. He stepped back outside, pulling the door shut behind him, and Ranger followed. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, large and well-muscled, his coat a rich blend of black and tan with a silvering muzzle that mirrored Frank's own aging. Ranger's ears stood alert even when his body was relaxed, amber eyes constantly scanning, not from anxiety, but from purpose. He had been Frank's shadow since the day they met at a shelter. A dog too disciplined for families looking for something cute. Too serious for people who didn't understand loyalty as a job. Ranger padded beside Frank now, paws sinking slightly into the wet snow, breath steady, unbothered by the cold. Frank stopped halfway between the cabin and the woodpile, rain snow soaking into his shoulders, water running down the back of his neck, and looked at the distance again. 20 feet. That was all. In the service, 20 feet had meant nothing. Here, in wet snow, carrying fuel that grew heavier with every step, it felt like crossing no man's land again and again. He imagined the path as a trench, himself walking it under fire, except now the enemy was dampness, time, and a winter that did not care about good intentions. Across the yard, a neighbor passed by on the road, slowing, squinting at Frank standing there with his dog and his miserable woodpile. The man laughed and shook his head, calling out something about Frank finally losing it up there in the cold. Frank didn't answer. He never did. He had learned after the war that arguing wasted energy better spent on preparation. Ranger tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether this was a threat or just noise, then returned his gaze to Frank, waiting. That was when Frank thought of the canvas. Inside the cabin, folded and forgotten, was an old tent fly, heavy duck cloth ripped along one seam during a storm years ago. Too damaged to repair, too sturdy to throw away. He saw it in his mind stretched not as shelter for people, but as protection for something more important right now. Fuel. Dry fuel. The thought didn't arrive fully formed. It came the way most useful ideas did for Frank quietly, without drama, fitting itself into the shape of a problem he had been staring at too long. By afternoon, the yard looked different. Frank worked without hurry, driving rough posts into the ground, tying rope with practiced knots his hands remembered even if his back protested. He pitched the canvas from the cabin door toward the woodpile, sloping it so water would run, leaving gaps at the bottom where air could move. The structure sagged in places, imperfect and unapologetic. Ranger stood watch nearby, occasionally stepping forward to test a rope with his nose, then retreating as if satisfied. More neighbors slowed to look. One laughed outright. Another muttered something about old men and bad ideas. Someone shouted, asking if Frank was building a tunnel to nowhere. Frank said nothing. Linda watched from the doorway, worry tightening her face, not because she thought it foolish, but because she understood what it meant to be the family people laughed at. When Frank finished, he stood back, wet, cold, and quietly certain. The canvas tunnel looked ridiculous, like a fallen tent too stubborn to lie flat. But when Frank walked through it, shoulders dry, hands dry, wood no longer soaked by the time he reached the stove, something settled in his chest. Ranger followed, tail low but wagging once, as if acknowledging a small victory. Behind them, the laughter lingered in the wet air, light and careless, not yet knowing it had picked the wrong target. The snow did not stop after that first day. It thickened, darkened, and learned how to linger. It came sideways on the wind off Portage Lake, melted just enough to soak, then froze again, sealing dampness into everything it touched. Frank Dalton learned quickly that the canvas tunnel was not a miracle, but a test one that demanded patience, attention, and discipline. Each morning he stepped into it with Ranger at his heel, boots crunching softly where snow slid off the sloped fabric and piled along the edges. The air inside felt different, not warm exactly, but alive, moving, carrying the faint scent of wood instead of rot. Frank noticed things the way he always had, through small measurements, how his shoulders stayed dry, how the logs felt slightly lighter by the third day, how steam no longer burst from the stove like a confession. He began to think the way the army had taught him to think after a bad winter overseas had nearly killed his unit, identify the real enemy. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't even the snow. It was moisture, invisible, patient, and ruthless, slipping into wood faster than the sky could pull it back out. Linda watched him from inside, worry tracing new lines around her eyes. She had always been a woman who carried concern quietly, tall and spare as a birch tree, her movements deliberate, her voice gentle even when fear pressed against her ribs. She believed in Frank, but belief did not silence the looks she felt when she walked into town. At the market, women glanced at her with that mix of pity and amusement reserved for families who had gone strange. "That tunnel of his," someone whispered once. Not unkindly, but not respectfully either. Linda smiled the way she always did, tight, polite, and said nothing. At night, when the stove burned cleaner but not yet strong, Frank lay awake listening to Ranger's steady breathing on the floor. The dog slept lightly, ears twitching at every creak of the cabin. A soldier even in rest. Frank's thoughts drifted backward to a winter decades ago, far from Michigan, when a poorly sealed fuel depot had filled a barracks with fumes. Two men hadn't woken up. Frank had stood outside afterward, freezing, hands shaking, making a promise to himself that if he ever had a family, he would never let something preventable steal air from their lungs. That promise pressed on him now as the stove hissed and Linda's cough echoed softer than before, but still there. By the fifth day, the difference became undeniable. Logs that had rested under the tunnel burned with a steady, honest flame, while the few pieces left exposed out of habit still smoked like bad lies. Frank fed the stove less often, watched the needle of the small thermometer climb past 60 and stay there. Mia stopped complaining about her fingers hurting. Lucy slept through the night without curling so tightly she looked folded. Ranger chose a spot closer to the hearth, content but alert, tail thumping once when Frank scratched the thick fur along his neck. It was on the 7th day that Gordon Pike came by. Gordon was the kind of man people listened to even before he spoke. In his late 50s, tall and square-framed, with a chest like a built-in beam and arms permanently dusted with saw marks, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had built things that outlasted arguments. His beard was iron gray, thick and carefully kept, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. He had been the town's carpenter for decades, a man whose barns survived storms and whose judgments survived scrutiny. When he stopped at Frank's yard, he did not laugh. He frowned. Gordon walked slowly around the tunnel, boots sinking into slush, one gloved hand tugging at the canvas edge, the other tapping a support post. Canvas traps moisture, he said finally, voice low and firm. Wood needs air. You're asking for mold, and when the wind really comes, this thing won't stand. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans, face calm, eyes steady. Air's moving, he replied, just not rain. Gordon shook his head, the way men do when they believe they are correcting foolishness. I've seen shortcuts fail, he said. This will too. He left without waiting for an answer, his words already ahead of him, spreading faster than Frank ever could. That night, Linda sat at the table long after the girls slept, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug for warmth more than comfort. They're talking, she said quietly. Frank nodded. They always do. What if Gordon's right? She asked, not accusing, just tired. Frank looked at the stove, at the steady flame, at Ranger's relaxed posture. Then I'll learn, he said, but I won't unlearn what's already working. The wind rose after that, a true northern wind, testing knots and patience alike. The canvas snapped but held. Snow slid off the slope in dull thuds. Frank reinforced where needed, adjusted tension, learned where the structure wanted to breathe. This was not pride. It was vigilance. He checked the wood daily, splitting pieces to inspect the heart. Pale, drying, honest. A neighbor passed one afternoon, shaking his head. Looks like a coffin, he joked. Frank didn't look up. Ranger did, fixing the man with a calm stare that made the laughter trail off. Inside, Linda's cough eased another notch, and the cabin smelled of heat instead of smoke. Frank felt the old oath settle deeper, not as a memory, but as a living thing. He did not need approval. He needed winter to speak. And winter, he knew, would be loud enough soon. Late November arrived like a verdict. The sky over Houghton collapsed into a single colorless mass, and the wind off Lake Superior no longer tested doors and roofs. It assaulted them. Snow came hard and horizontal, driven by gusts that found every weakness in a wall, every loose seam in a jacket. By nightfall, drifts rose knee-high along fences, then waist-high, and the road beyond Frank Dalton's cabin vanished as if the town itself had decided to hide. In houses across the hillside, men dug at their woodpiles with shovels and axes, chipping away ice to reach logs fused together like bones in a frozen grave. When they hauled those logs inside, the result was always the same: a choking hiss, a plume of bitter smoke, flames that flared briefly and died like exhausted matches. Families woke again and again to cold rooms and colder fear, feeding stoves every hour just to keep the walls from frosting over. Frank woke once that night, not to cold, but to habit. He rose quietly, his movements slow but precise, pulling on the same red and black flannel jacket as if it were armor. Ranger stood at once, 7 years old now but still sharp, thick chest rising with a calm confidence that came from knowing his place. The dog's paws made no sound on the cabin floor as he followed Frank to the door. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but when Frank stepped into the canvas tunnel, the sound dulled, broken into softer, manageable breaths. Snow slid down the sloped fabric in muffled sheets. His shoulders stayed dry. His hands did not numb. The wood beneath the canvas felt lighter, cleaner, almost warm by comparison, its surface no longer slick with rot. He carried an armload back inside and fed the stove. The fire took immediately, honest and strong, pushing heat outward in steady waves. Linda stirred in her sleep but did not cough. She lay on her side, long frame relaxed for the first time in weeks, her breathing even. Her face, pale in the firelight, had lost some of the tight strain that had lived there since October. Frank sat for a moment, watching the flame, and felt the smallest easing in his chest, the quiet satisfaction of something working when it mattered most. By dawn, the storm had buried the town. Smoke hung low and heavy over rooftops, a sign not of warmth but of struggle. That was when Ethan Briggs appeared. Ethan was in his early 40s, lean and sharp-featured, with a narrow beard that never quite hid the lines cut into his face by years of trapping and bad decisions. He had been quick with jokes before the snow came, loud in a way that made people laugh even when they didn't agree. That morning, he stood on Frank's porch with his shoulders hunched and pride already halfway spent. Snow clung to his coat and beard, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and lack of sleep. Ranger reached the door first and planted himself squarely in the frame, head high, amber eyes fixed on Ethan without hostility, only judgment. Frank opened the door behind him. Ethan cleared his throat. "You got any dry kindling?" he asked, skipping greetings. Frank looked past him at the town below, at the thin columns of smoke struggling upward, then back at Ethan. He nodded once. Inside, he gathered a small bundle of wood from under the tunnel, pieces that rang faintly when knocked together, a sound only dry wood made. When he returned, Ethan stared, not at Frank, but at the bundle in his hands. "That's dry," he said quietly, as if saying it louder might make it untrue. Frank handed it over. Ethan took it, weighing it, feeling the difference. "Mind showing me how you built that thing?" he asked, the joke gone from his voice. Ranger stepped aside, tail flicking once, granting passage. Throughout the day, others noticed. Men walked by slower, eyes lingering on the tunnel, on the way snow refused to settle on it, on the steady heat leaking from Frank's chimney. Some said nothing, some shook their heads, none laughed. In the afternoon, Gordon Pike passed at a distance, stopping briefly to look. He did not come closer. His face was unreadable, beard stiff with frost, eyes narrowed not in anger, but calculation. Inside the cabin, Mia and Lucy played without gloves, cheeks pink instead of pale. Mia watched the storm through the window and asked why other houses looked sad. Frank didn't answer directly. "Because they're tired," he said instead. That night, the wind rose again, harder than before. The canvas snapped, but held. Frank checked the ropes once, tightening a knot, adjusting a post. Ranger stood beside him, snow dusting his back, unbothered. Down the hill, a light flickered on and off at Ethan's place as he fought his stove. The storm did not care about reputations. It cared only about preparation. By morning, footprints led to Frank's door. No laughter followed them, only questions. And Frank, tired but steady, knew the silence was not defeat. It was the sound of men listening. The cold did what arguments never could. By the third day after the blizzard, Houghton moved differently, quieter, as if the town itself had learned to conserve energy. Doors opened less often, voices dropped, and when people walked, they walked with purpose, not curiosity. That was how they came to Frank Dalton's yard, not all at once, but in ones and twos that gathered without planning, drawn by the simple rumor that his cabin was warm and his stove was not being fed every hour like a desperate mouth. Frank noticed them from the doorway, his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket dark against the snow, his posture steady, neither defensive nor triumphant. Ranger stood beside him, shoulders square, tail relaxed, the look of a dog who had decided this was his post now. Men stood with their hands tucked deep into their coats, breath fogging, eyes tracking the canvas tunnel from end to end as if it might change shape if watched too closely. Gordon Pike arrived last. He did not announce himself. He never did. He was dressed as he always was in winter. Heavy wool coat dusted white, thick gray beard rimed with frost, his broad hands bare despite the cold, fingers scarred and stiff from decades of work. Gordon had built half the town with those hands. He had lost a brother years back when a poorly vented stove filled a hunting cabin with smoke, a night that had hardened him into a man who trusted structure over improvisation, rules over instinct. Now he stood in Frank's yard like a man staring at a sum that refused to balance. Frank did not greet him specially. He did not greet anyone. He simply waited. It was Ethan Briggs who broke the silence first, clearing his throat. Ethan looked different than he had days before, still lean, still sharp-faced, but quieter, his humor packed away with his pride. "It's warmer here," he said, stating a fact rather than a compliment. Frank nodded once. "It burns cleaner," he added, and this time several men murmured agreement. Gordon stepped closer to the tunnel and crouched, gloved hands tugging lightly at the canvas edge, testing the give. He stood, walked its length, counted posts with his eyes. "You're not sealing it," he said at last. Not accusing, just observing. "No," Frank replied. "Frank's sealing traps moisture," Gordon grunted. Frank continued, not lecturing, just explaining the way one soldier explained to another where not to step. The canvas blocks snow and rain. The bottom stays open so air moves. The slope sheds weight. The wood dries because it can breathe without getting wet. Someone asked how steep the slope was. Frank showed them with his hands. Someone else asked why it was built on the south side. Frank explained the little warmth that leaked from the cabin. Not heat exactly, but enough to tip the balance. Linda stood a little apart near the door, her slim frame wrapped in a coat, watching faces change. She recognized the look resistance giving way to curiosity edging toward respect. It did not erase the weeks of worry, but it softened them. The test had not been Frank's idea. It came from a man named Harold Simmons, a retired railroad clerk with thin white hair and a habit of tapping numbers on his thigh when thinking. Harold was not strong, not loud, but he was precise. "Let's measure," he said, voice carrying just enough authority to be heard. "Same amount of wood, same time." Frank nodded. He did not argue. He never had. They agreed on a simple comparison. 3 cabins, Frank's, Ethan's, and one belonging to a younger homesteader named Will Carter, broad-faced and red-bearded, whose wood sat under a traditional 3-sided shed. They used equal-sized splits, weighed by hand and judgment, started the fires at the same hour. Thermometers were hung where they could be seen. Ranger wandered between groups, tail swinging, pausing occasionally to sniff a boot or a glove, earning a laugh when he trotted the length of the tunnel again and again, as if supervising. "Call it Ranger's Highway," someone joked, and this time the laughter stayed. The results did not need embellishment. After an hour, Frank's cabin climbed past 65 and kept rising. Ethan's stalled in the mid-50s, smoke thickening the air. Will's fared better, but the fire demanded constant feeding. After 3 hours, Frank added 1 log. Ethan had added 3. The numbers were written down by Harold. neat and unforgiving. When they weighed ash days later, the difference grew sharper. Frank's stove left fine gray powder. Ethan's left heavy chunks and half-burned wood. Gordon watched all of it without speaking, his face unreadable, his mind clearly working. At dusk, as the group began to break apart, Gordon stayed behind. He stood near the tunnel, boots planted, hands resting on his hips. Frank waited. Snow fell softly now, no wind, the world quiet enough to hear the stove ticking inside the cabin. Finally, Gordon spoke. "I was wrong." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They landed heavier than praise ever could. He exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. "It's crude," he added, almost smiling despite himself. "But it works." Frank nodded once. "Frank, that was all. No victory speech. No told you so." Linda felt something unclench inside her chest. That night, as the town returned to their colder homes with warmer thoughts, Frank sat by the stove and watched Ranger stretch out along the hearth, content and alert all at once. The tunnel stood outside, sagging a little, imperfect, but solid. Winter had spoken, and for once it had been answered with numbers instead of noise. Winter did not loosen its grip on Houghton after the numbers spoke. If anything, it seemed to lean in closer, as if curious whether the town would remember what it had just learned. In the days that followed Gordon Pike's admission, small changes appeared everywhere. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. A strip of canvas showed up behind the Simmons place, slung low and awkward but pitched enough to shed snow. 2 houses down, Will Carter replaced the open side of his woodshed with salvaged planks, leaving a deliberate gap at the bottom the way Frank had shown him. By the end of the week, there were tunnels of every kind. Tarps faded to the color of old paper. Cedar boards scavenged from fallen fences. Sheets of corrugated metal weighted with stones. Even overlapping birch bark stitched together by hands that remembered older ways. The materials differed wildly, but the idea stayed intact, moving through the neighborhood like a shared language. Keep the weather out, let the air move, lift the wood from the wet ground, and borrow just a breath of warmth when you can. Frank watched it happen without comment. He had not set out to teach, only to solve a problem. But people came to him anyway, standing at the edge of his yard with questions shaped by cold nights and stiff fingers. He answered them the same way each time, plainly, without pride, explaining slopes and spacing, warning against sealing things too tight, reminding them that snow had weight and water had patience. Ranger followed him as he walked from one makeshift build to the next, 7 years old and steady, tail moving in slow arcs, accepting scratches from gloved hands like a foreman, accepting thanks he had not asked for. The dog had become a familiar presence now, a sign that Frank was nearby, that help came without judgment. Linda felt the shift more keenly than Frank ever did. At the market, where she once sensed the sideways looks and soft murmurs, women now stopped her openly. They asked about canvas weight, about rope versus wire, about how steep was steep enough. Linda answered with growing confidence, her tall, slender frame straightening, her voice warming as she realized the pity had vanished. Her hair, usually pulled back in that loose knot, fell forward one afternoon as she leaned over a sack of flour, and she laughed as she tucked it away, surprised at the sound of her own ease. For weeks she had carried the quiet burden of being the wife of the man people laughed at. Now she carried something else, a shared knowledge that made her part of a solution instead of an explanation. Gordon Pike did not build a tunnel. Pride, Frank suspected, would not allow that. But Gordon adapted in his own way, closing two sides of his woodshed with scrap lumber, adding a sloped canvas roof that angled sharply toward the south. He said nothing about it. But when Frank passed by one afternoon, Gordon nodded once, a small acknowledgement between men who understood the cost of being wrong and the greater cost of staying that way. Others went further. Ethan Briggs extended his tunnel all the way to a small outbuilding, turning the walk between chores into a dry passage. Ethan worked harder than most, his lean frame moving with the urgency of someone determined to erase a memory of desperation. He talked less now, but when he did, it was to offer help, to carry posts or hold canvas while knots were tied. Will Carter widened his structure enough to stack wood on both sides of a narrow path, doubling capacity and laughing at his own cleverness when Ranger trotted through it without brushing the sides. Even Harold Simmons, thin and meticulous, began sketching variations in a small notebook, recording what worked and what sagged, treating winter like a ledger that had to be balanced. By January, the town looked different. Smoke rose thinner and cleaner from chimneys. Fires lasted longer. People slept through the night. The innovation did not have a name anyone agreed on. Some called it the wood tunnel. Others said canvas shed. A few jokingly referred to Ranger's Highway, and the name stuck just enough to make children grin. What mattered was not the label, but the effect. Families used less wood. Lungs burned less. Tempers cooled. When a traveling delivery man from downstate stopped to ask why so many homes had odd coverings stretching across their yards, the answer came easily from whoever happened to be nearby. Because it works. That simplicity felt almost sacred. Frank took the tunnel down one afternoon in early April, when the snow finally softened and the air smelled faintly of thawed earth. He did it carefully, rolling the canvas and storing it inside, leaving the posts in place like punctuation marks in the ground. He knew winter would return, and he preferred to greet it prepared. Ranger lay nearby, eyes half closed, soaking up the weak sun, rising only when Frank finished to follow him back inside. The town did not mark the change with ceremony. There were no speeches, no plaques. That was as it should be. In a place where survival depended on shared effort, the highest honor an idea could earn was repetition. Long after the laughter faded, long after the story lost its novelty, the tunnels remained rebuilt each fall, adjusted, improved, passed along to new families with the same simple explanation. Frank never corrected anyone who forgot where it had started. He did not need credit. He had warmth, a quiet house, and the steady presence of a dog who slept soundly by the hearth. That was enough. Winter had taught them all something old dressed up as new, and Houghton, for once, listened. In the end, what people called a miracle was never the canvas, the wood, or even the warmth that filled those cabins. The miracle was quieter than that. It was the moment when a man chose responsibility over pride, patience over noise, and faith over fear. In Scripture, we're reminded that God often works not through thunder, but through obedience, through hands that build, eyes that notice, and hearts that refuse to give up when the world laughs. Frank's tunnel didn't break the laws of nature. It honored them. And in doing so, it became a blessing, not just for one family, but for an entire community. That same truth still walks with us today. In our own lives, we face winters that aren't always made of snow seasons of doubt, struggle, and exhaustion. And more often than not, God's answer doesn't arrive as a sudden rescue, but as a small, steady idea placed in our hands, asking only that we trust it and see it through. What looks foolish at first may be the very thing heaven is using to keep us standing. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might be fighting their own winter right now. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories where faith meets everyday life, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you and your home, keep you warm in every season, and guide your steps even when the path ahead doesn't yet make sense. Amen.